Ladies and gentlemen, quite some time has passed since I last made a video glazing Feain, so of course I'm obligated to make another one more recently, right? Feain is the best aging DPS from the entirety of Amphorius, and I don't care what anybody has to say. Feain was arguably the most doom-posted Ampho character throughout the entire version. Some may say Cyrene, however, at least with Cyrene, most people were like, yeah, she has this team, but the rest kinda suck. People were legit talking about Feain being so bad that Saber completely mogged him in terms of value, right? And I remember back then trying to explain to people how Feain, although one of the DPSs with the most obvious flaws, his Eidolon investment, his Lycone investment, him getting dedicated supports in the future, and the way his kit works, allowing him to be indirectly buffed very easily, will make him one of the best aging, and because of how simple his playstyle is, he'd be a big pickup for the more casual player base. However, at that time, as always, when there's a new DPS dropping and mains are trying to agenda post to get their favorite character stronger, I was receiving backlash nonetheless. However, I would like to say, with a fat smile on my face, my take has aged very well, right? Feain currently is one of the best aging, if not the best aging, MOC Zero Cycler among the entire Ampho cast. However, not only this, he's also one of the best and consistently beating Mono Rem against AAs currently. However, not only this, he also is even slightly competitive with Mono Rem against, let's say, the current Pure Fiction. The difference to be able to zero cycle the current Pure Fiction is Mono Rem with Cassie at 9 cost and as well as Feain at 11. Now that is a 2 cost difference. However, the thing to note here is that Feain zero cycle is done with Sparkle, who a lot of people received for completely free, meaning in a lot of people's eyes this is actually like 10 cost versus 9 cost, which is crazy because you need to consider that the majority of Cassie's team outside of her own Dragon Explosion are AoE attackers with incredibly frequent attack spam. Meanwhile, Feain is a specifically bounce DPS without any AoE specific capabilities, right? So to be able to hold himself that well against a team that is that strong and dedicated towards AoE is incredibly impressive. Now, of course, different enemy lineups and certain weaknesses favoring certain teams can definitely play a role in one DPS doing better than the other. However, the point gets across that the doom posting this guy received, especially on his release, was completely overblown and aged terribly, and he still to this day has the strongest E2 jump in the game, even including upcoming Himiko. Now, Himiko has a Feain level E0 to E2 jump, however, it's not actually Feain level, and especially when you talk about higher targets like 3 and even up to 5 perma targets on field, Feain's E2 is simply unbeatable, right? So his E2 still stands to today as the biggest jump a character can receive from it. However, of course, we need to talk about why it is that he's aged so well. I've already glossed over it a little bit just a minute ago with Sparkle. he is the easiest DPS to indirectly buff with new support power creep. This was one of the main selling points that he's always had and that I've always drove home when recommending people to him and talking about the possibility of him becoming stronger in the future. If you look at every single Amphorius DPS's best clears, best zero cycles against MOC, they will all have their dedicated teammates without a single fail, right? Feain is the only one who for over the last year, his lowest cost zero cycles have been him E2S0, E2S1, or E2 with Nova Sparkle, or E2 with just Ceridra, and then the rest are just standard characters like RMC, or Bronya, or Tingyun, stuff like that, right? He is the only one who is not so reliant on his dedicated supports and can quite easily get away without them so long as you invest heavy into his E2. And a lot of people back then didn't believe that indirect support power creep would actually be that strong, but as you can see, new version power creep hits, everybody's glazing Nova Welt, everybody's glazing Nova Sparkle, and Nova Sparkle was even given for free. Everybody's glazing M-Blade because he is basically a E4 Welt equivalent in an E0 limited character. All of this is incredibly impressive, right? So because of him getting all these indirect buffs from new character releases, new free characters, Novas, and all of this, he is able to stand the test of time until inevitably he gets his own Nova Flare, I imagine likely somewhere in the midst of version 5. However, to make things even better, he is likely soon going to get another buff. The reason for this is it has been leaked by one of the most reliable leakers in the entirety of the space, Full Stop Chan, that Sunday will be in the next batch of Nova Flares. And we've seen from a semi-reliable leaker on, I believe, Tieba or Red Note, whichever of the two it was, he only got one thing wrong out of everything he leaked, and he leaked quite a bit, making him decently reliable, that Sunday's Nova would be on a similar, if not slightly stronger level than Sparkle's, right? Now, this isn't that hard to believe in the first place, considering Sunday is the more relevant character of the two story-wise, and especially currently in the story. However, not only that, Sunday is also getting his Nova Flare later, because supposedly it's not in 4.4, meaning it's likely, in my opinion, going to be in 4.6. So it's almost a year after Sparkles, making it much more likely that it's obviously stronger. Now, why does Sunday getting a Nova Flare, why is that such a big deal for Feain? Well, for one, with the recent changes that Sparkle got in her Nova, she no longer has a 1-turn buff, and it's actually 2 turns. This means you can run double action advancer with Feain. Now, currently, there are not 2 action advancers who are actually super strong to run alongside with Sparkle, so it's usually recommended that you don't bother running 2 limited action advancers together, cough cough Sunday, and instead you just run like Nova Sparkle plus Ceridra, or Nova Sparkle plus a strong AoE support, right? However, with Sunday receiving a Nova, this would completely change. If you make Sunday's Nova on the same level as Sparkle's, then what happens is that multiple action advances leads to Feain receiving significantly more stacks a lot more quickly. On top of this, Feain's synergy with energy characters, being able to feed him more stacks than normal characters like Sparkle, let's say, would make stacking his ult even easier, making sustainless double action advancer Feain, even without Siren, actually quite viable, more than most people would realize. However, outside of all of this, there are 2 more things to mention. One, his buffs. Of course, his buffs becoming sparkle level would mean that now he technically has like 2 E1 Tribby level buffers on his team, all focusing it all on him. However, too, it was mentioned in the leaks, although slightly questionable, for Sunday's Nova Flare that his E1 would get the biggest rework among all his Eidolons, and his ties to needing summon restrictions would completely disappear, right? The reason this is huge is because Sunday's E1 has 40% defense shred on it. Nobody has been able to take full advantage of this E1 because the 40% has been locked towards the summon specifically and the summon's damage. However, if they were to remove this restriction and make the defense shred completely apply to the character as well, Feain would get 40% more defense shred on top of the defense shred he already gets from his own Lycone and could possibly be getting from other teammates. For example, if you put him with E1 Ruan Mei, E2 Sparkle, M-Blade, right? Any of these characters would work in massively buffing him and synergizing with a Sparkle plus Sunday team, in which his damage would completely skyrocket. A lot of people don't know this, however, not even including 40%, the last 30% defense shred jump from 70 to 100 nearly doubles the effectiveness of the past 70% defense shred in terms of buffing your total damage. 40% would actually more than double it if it allows you to go from 60 all the way to 100, or even if you just get close to near the edge over here in the 80s or 90s, it's still incredibly valuable, right? So with all this being said, I think it's no exaggeration to call Feain basically the new Age Jingyuan. He is going to only continue getting indirectly buffed by stronger and stronger supports releasing over time, and on top of this, he will eventually get his own Nova, likely midway through 5.x, I'd imagine, as his base kit does have quite a few flaws, and I will admit a lot of this glaze is allocated towards his E2 performance and not his base kit performance, right? Let me know what you guys think about Feain. Do you think I'm overglazing? Do you think I'm correctly glazing? I think that he deserves this glaze, especially after the immense amount of Doom posting that he received back in the earlier days of him releasing. He still stands the test of time. He's getting a rerun very, very soon. Now, would I say getting his E2 if you're starting from E0 still worth it? That depends, right? If you already have a significant amount of investment into his supports, I'd say yeah, go for it. However, with the power creep I'm seeing in some of these newer version 4 characters, as sad as it is to admit, I'd probably recommend someone just start from scratch, building a completely new team, instead of going further into his own vertical investment if you don't also have the support investment to go alongside it, because it is just a little too expensive. And after you get Feain E2 and after you get some of his support optimal investments, there isn't that much vertical investment left that's like really, really strong for him, while these new teams can compete with an E2 Feain at completely E0, and then they also have as broken a vertical investment. For example, Himiko. Himiko has a similar E2 jump to Feain, but her base E0 is already stronger than E2 Feain. And to make matters even worse, this base E0 Himiko team is using Welt and RMC, who are two completely free characters as well, right? So that's kinda the thing going on with this. New version power creep is very bad. However, this does not mean Feain, especially at E2 with some of his supports, will not be able to clear. That's not at all what I'm saying. In fact, I would say if you like Feain a lot, you can continue to invest into him and his E2 and his supports. Ignore newer teams because he'll likely last the entirety of this version and even a little bit of version 5 at that level of investment. And then it's likely he'll get a Nova, or one of his supports like Ceredra will get a Nova at this point in time, further elevating his performance. And then once he's Nova'd, he'd be on the level, if not even possibly slightly stronger than some of the 4.x teams that we are seeing currently, because that's just something consistent with Nova flares, is that they massively buff their DPSs. And Feain especially, who is incredibly similar to Firefly in terms of the way his kit functions and the flaws that it has, they would 100% give him the good treatment. Right. Love you all. Hope you all have a great day. Hope you all have a great night. Peace out.